The shocking history of how sugar became a drug. The soda machine hums. His hands shake. Coins clatter. He whispers, "I need it," like a confession. When the can drops, the first sip lands like relief. One detail that'll matter later. As tobacco ad dollars dried up, sugar's budget swelled. Brands didn't just fill a gap, they inherited a playbook. If sugar behaves like a drug, who made it that way and why? To see the addiction, go back to when sugar was a luxury for kings, prescribed like medicine. Rewind to sweet beginnings, before chemistry, policy, and marketing scaled the craving into a daily habit you barely notice anymore. From spice rack to status symbol, to understand how sweetness became routine, start when it was rare. Sugar arrives in Europe through trade routes and crusader contact, treated less like food and more like a spice, measured by the pinch, sold by apothecaries, whispered about as a tonic for weakness. In a world of bitter ales and sour breads, sweetness was a little miracle. The rich bought miracles by the pound. In wealthy houses, sugar loaves stood like trophies, hard conical blocks wrapped in blue paper. Servants filed them down into glittering shards, the rasp scraping like a saw. Those shavings sweetened sauces and preserved fruit, then appeared again in the dining room as marzipan sculptures. Swans, castles, entire gardens you could eat. Sweetness was theater. It signaled power. Teeth told the same story. Look closely at court portraits and you'll catch the irony, the blackened smiles of people who could afford cane. Rot became a status marker, a quiet signal that you were rich enough to ruin your mouth. Meanwhile, the poor watched working kitchens where sugar was handled like gold, counted, rationed, locked away in cabinets with keys. But fashion needed supply. The Caribbean offered it. Plantations spread across islands like a grid, powered by enslaved labor that turned cane into crystals and molasses with brutal efficiency. Nights glowed with boiling houses, days stretched through harvests that didn't forgive mistakes. The commodity that arrived in London docks looked clean, white, civilized. Its production was anything but. Sweetness seeped into daily rituals. Tea, once bitter and medicinal, bloomed into a national habit when sugar arrived to tame it. A teaspoon altered taste and social life in one motion. Tea breaks at mills, tea tables in drawing rooms, cups shared across classes, with sweetness marking where you fell on the ladder. One spoon if you could manage it, two if you could spare it, three if you wanted to show off. A London dock worker finishes his shift with salt on his skin and a few coins in his pocket. He heads for a stall that sells molasses cake cut into thick slabs. He buys one, then another, telling himself the sugar helps him keep going. He wraps a piece to take home, changes his mind, and eats that too before he reaches the corner. By morning, he'll be back on the docks, and the cake will be waiting where he remembers it. City life turned sugar from ceremony into habit. Preserves lengthened seasons. Confectioners started shaping childhood with penny sweets that fit into tiny palms and disappeared fast. Coffee houses poured cups sweet enough to pull in customers and keep them. The rasping of sugar loaves moved from aristocratic kitchens to backrooms of shops, to storerooms above alleyways where clerks learned to smooth the filings into paper cones and carry them out to counter. The first whispers of trouble were easy to ignore. Dentists wrote pamphlets about decay. Physicians noted stomach complaints. Moralists scolded, but no one likes a scold at a party. In the ledger of status, sweetness still balanced in favor of fashion. There was always another tea to host, another cake to slice, another marzipan garden to build before it collapsed. Meanwhile, cost curves shifted. Beet sugar experiments in Europe hinted at a future where cane wasn't the only path to crystals. Refining improved, trade routes multiplied. With every technological improvement, a pinch became a spoon, and a spoon became a standard. Once sugar stopped being a singular event and started showing up in ordinary foods, palates recalibrated. The memory of bitterness faded. Unsweet began to taste wrong. By the time servants no longer needed to file sugar loaves in wealthy homes, because refined granules came in clean bags, sweetness had crossed the line from display to daily expectation. It didn't ask permission to enter new recipes, it slipped in. Bread softened, sauces rounded. Porridge turned into breakfast people craved, not endured. Parents learned that a sweeter cup soothed a child. The stage was set. A commodity born in ceremony, paid for in human suffering, had become routine. Demand didn't just rise, it learned how to demand itself. The next act would make that loop formal. Factories, brands, and the promise that a reliable sweetness could be stamped into any product, sold anywhere, and tasted exactly the same tomorrow as it did today. The industrial sweet switch. Factories didn't invent sweetness, but they industrialized it. The turning point wasn't a new craving, it was supply. When Napoleon's blockade choked cane imports in the early 1800s, Europe fast-tracked beet sugar. Suddenly, fields that never felt a tropical sun were sprouting a domestic answer to cane. Labs, not plantations, drove the gain. Chemists learned to coax crystals from beets, and once that door opened, it didn't close. Refining followed the same curve as steam engines and railways: faster, cleaner, cheaper. Bone char filters whitened crystals, vacuum pans squeezed time out of boiling, centrifuges flung syrup from solids with efficient spin. Granulated sugar arrived uniform, storable, and predictable. Price fell. The pinch became a scoop. Scoops turned into recipes printed on paper bags, teaching households to bake like small factories. Cheap sweetness didn't sit on shelves, it infiltrated. Bakers cut bitterness from bread crust by adding a little sugar to feed yeast and speed rise. Sauce makers found a dash rounded the acid edge of tomatoes and vinegar. Baby food makers leaned on it to make purees taste friendly. Manufacturers called sweetness a quality signal, a reliable stamp that their jar would taste the same from batch to batch, shelf to shelf, city to city. Children felt the shift first. What had been an occasional treat began appearing at breakfast in disguised forms. Cereal grains roasted with sugar coatings crackled in milk. Cocoa powders came pre-sweetened, so no one had to guess the ratio. Dentists started charting decay patterns that skewed younger, mapping mouths like epidemiologists map outbreaks. They recognized a new rhythm: sugar woven into daily staples, not isolated dessert. Grocery brands embraced standardization like gospel. A label promised a calibrated sweetness, the same across regions and seasons. Behind the scenes, test kitchens kept records so precise they read like aviation manuals: grams per serving, solubility curves, browning at specific temperatures. The goal wasn't novelty, it was familiarity. The tongue would learn to expect a certain profile, and products would deliver it without fail. Palates adjusted, almost invisibly. Foods that once tasted normal began to seem stark unless softened by sugar. Coffee without sugar felt austere, plain yogurt tasted wrong, bread lacked freshness unless a hint of sweetness signaled softness. People didn't announce the change, they responded to it. Choices nudged, then habits formed, then expectations hardened. Meanwhile, the first pushback landed with a thud. Medical journals carried warnings about dental caries and metabolic strain, but the authors often sounded scolding, moralizing in a culture enthralled by progress. Steam, glass, rails, light bulbs, and here came sugar, packaged innovation you could eat. Who wanted to hear a cautionary tale from a white-coated killjoy while factories put jam in jars and cookies in tins? A worker on a biscuit line learned the new discipline: count the seconds of bake, measure the syrup's temperature, check the glaze's sheen. One afternoon the tank runs a little cooler, the glaze isn't as glossy. The supervisor frowns. Customers know. He doesn't mean they'll notice consciously, he means their mouths will. The batch gets reworked. Consistency isn't preference now, it's policy. By the late 19th century, sweetness had colonized the daily menu. Condensed milk thickened and sweetened tea on ships and in mining camps, turning harsh work into moments that tasted familiar. Ketchup slid from tart to sweet tart. Pickles, once bracing, edged toward bread and butter. Even medicines leaned on sugar to mask bitterness in syrups and lozenges, training children to equate relief with sweet. The numbers encouraged manufacturers to keep going. Price per pound continued to drop. Scaling up rewarded those who used sugar not just as an ingredient, but as a design principle. A jam with 55% sugar wouldn't mold as fast as one with 45%. A cake with the right sugar crystal size would stay moist longer on the shelf. Sweetness wasn't just flavor, it was shelf life, texture, and customer return probability wrapped into one. Home kitchens mirrored the industrial logic. Cookbooks shifted from season to taste to 1 cup sugar, assigning sweetness as a structural component. The teaspoon in tea became a measuring cup in cake. A cup became 2. Mothers learned that a sweeter cereal calmed fights before school. Fathers picked a brand because the last box tasted right after a long day. Somewhere between the grocer's counter and the breakfast table, choice hardened into ritual. There were benefits. Calories became easier to access, food safer, seasons extended by preserves that actually lasted. There were costs. Mouths acclimated to a sweetness baseline that crept up year after year. Each new product protected the last one's level by matching or slightly exceeding it. No meeting decided that drift. It was a competitive equilibrium. If your sauce tasted less rounded than theirs, you lost the repeat purchase. As for those early warnings, they lingered at the edges. A few clinics drew links between frequent sugar exposure and decay. Some public health voices muttered about civilization diseases, but the market was louder. Factories whistled, delivery carts rolled, and children asked for the cereal with the crunch that sparkled on the tongue. Social proof did the rest. When every lunchbox and ad carried the same sweet signal, opting out felt like opting out of the group. Marketing was about to hand this industrial engine a story. Sweetness wouldn't just be cheap and consistent, it would become energy, wholesome, and recommended. The habit had a machine. Next, it would have a message. Selling sweetness, the birth of sugar marketing. Factories had the product. Now they needed belief. Between the 1920s and 1950s, advertising wrapped sugar in lab coats and lunch pails. Quick energy became the headline, a promise that a cube or a candy bar could flip a switch in your body and keep you moving. Print ads showed nurses smiling over sugar bowls, athletes grinning with chocolate bars tucked in their socks, parents stirring heaping spoonfuls into children's milk because healthful sounded like a prescription, not a pitch. An office worker learned the rhythm. By 11:30, he felt a slump, eyes heavy, head fogged. He started keeping a small candy in his desk, unwrapping it when the clock hit the same mark every day. At first, he noticed how fast the lift arrived, then he started timing meetings around it. He wasn't just eating sugar, he was training a cue. Routine became ritual, and the wrapper's crinkle turned into a bell. Campaigns did the rest. A spoonful a day sounds quaint now, but it landed like a rule. Recipes in women's magazines folded that spoonful into breakfast, then lunch boxes, then the afternoon pick-me-up. Home economists on radio shows taught mothers to balance the day with little sweets, an apple coated in caramel, a glass of milk made more nourishing with chocolate syrup. The language blurred want and need. Energy wasn't just calories, it was virtue you could pour. Hospitality followed the same arc. A good host offered dessert not as a treat, but as a sign of care. Cake for birthdays, pie for Sundays, cookies for visitors who dropped in unannounced. Declining dessert felt like declining the person. Ads leaned into that pressure. Families gathered around frosted centerpieces. Neighbors judged a home by the cookie jar. If sugar arrived at every celebration, sweetness started to define what celebration meant. Behind the scenes, marketers weren't flying blind. Internal memos tracked what they called craving-driven cycles, the time gap between purchase and repurchase, the list of contexts that triggered reaching for a sweet, work breaks, boredom, driving, studying. Sales teams watched weather patterns and payroll calendars and noticed spikes on rainy afternoons and payday Fridays. The lesson was simple. Embed sugar where habits already live, then reinforce the association until it feels natural. Doctors appeared in the ads, too. White coats gave cover to slogans that called sugar doctor-approved for quick energy, especially for children who were growing fast. The science was thin, but the presentation felt authoritative. A mother standing in a grocery aisle didn't parse metabolic pathways. She read reassurance printed next to a smiling pediatrician and put the box in the cart. Across town, a soda ad promised energy you can feel, and the copy suggested one with lunch and another mid-afternoon, prepackaged rituals you could buy. Meanwhile, companies standardized sweetness into a brand promise. The bar would taste the same in January or July. The cookie would snap with the same sweetness you remembered from last week's party. Consistency trained palates and simplified decisions. If you wanted comfort or a small reward, you didn't have to gamble. You knew which box to reach for because last time delivered precisely the lift you expected. What nobody outside the conference rooms knew was how tightly the loop was being measured and optimized around the cue routine reward cycle that turns moments into rituals. Executives debated package sizes to manage pace of consumption. Smaller bars encouraged daily buying. Family-sized packs increased household availability and raised the odds of impulse snacking. Memos highlighted heavy users, a small slice of customers who drove a big slice of sales. Keep them engaged and the revenue curve smoothed. Lose them and the quarter got bumpy. There were early critics, but the counter-narrative was nimble. If someone complained about tooth decay, ad copy shifted to brush after every meal, not question the meal. If fatigue returned an hour after a candy break, the solution offered was an extra candy, not a different lunch. Sugar sold the spike, then sold the fix for the drop with a second spike. The cycle didn't need villainy to thrive. It needed familiarity, repetition, and a story that made the cue feel like care. A small scene in a diner captures the change. A waitress refills coffee, then asks, 2 sugars, right? The customer nods without thinking. A pie carousel spins within arm's reach, slices gleaming. The check arrives with 2 mints balanced on top. None of it feels like marketing. It feels like hospitality. But each gesture has a lineage in meetings where someone mapped how sweetness could live at the table, the counter, the register. By the 1950s, the pitch matured. Ads paired sugar with modernity, sleek kitchens, chrome appliances, high-energy lifestyles. You're busy, you need fuel. The message landed just as dual-income households and suburban commutes expanded. Portable sweets solved a new problem: eat comfort without stopping. The afternoon crash had a pre-approved answer, and it lived in glove compartments, purses, and desk drawers. Then the ground shifted. As heart disease research emerged and waistlines drew attention, fat started to look like the enemy. For marketers, it wasn't just a threat, it was an opening. If fat took the blame for what people feared, sugar could step forward as the fix, low-fat food sweetened to taste right. That pivot needed science, or at least the appearance of it. And the industry knew exactly where to look to make that case land. The big pivot: blaming fat, quieting sugar. 3 things happened almost at once: funding, headlines, and labels. In the 1960s, the Sugar Research Foundation put money on the table for prominent scientists to review the causes of heart disease. The brief was narrow: scrutinize saturated fat and cholesterol, while sugar's role stayed in the footnotes. The resulting papers, published in respected journals, emphasized fat as the problem the public should fear. Newspapers echoed it. By breakfast the next morning, fat had a villain's mask, and sugar kept its smile. This wasn't a cartoon conspiracy, it was influence working as designed. Industry money didn't write sentences, it steered questions. Researchers probed fat's chemistry and epidemiology with urgency, while sugar's metabolic impacts remained inconclusive, needs more research, or confounded by lifestyle. In press interviews, fat equals heart disease became the shorthand. Complexity collapsed into a slogan you could put on a cereal box. People didn't read footnotes in grocery aisles. They read headlines. Guidelines followed. Committees drafting national dietary advice leaned hard into fat reduction. The message filtered into schools, clinics, and kitchen tables: avoid fat to protect your heart. Food makers raced to comply, reformulating yogurts, dressings, cookies, and snacks into low-fat versions. But fat carries flavor and texture. Remove it and the mouthfeel collapses. The fix slid in quietly: add sugar to restore taste and keep you coming back. The fat line on the label dropped. The sugar line climbed. A mother in a bright supermarket aisle picked up a low-fat yogurt with a heart icon on the lid. The front promised light, healthy, recommended. Her kid peeled the foil, took a spoonful, and locked onto the sweetness instantly. The yogurt didn't taste like restraint, it tasted like reward. That's how the pivot landed at home, an exchange hidden inside good intentions, reinforced by packaging that felt like medicine wearing a smile. Meanwhile, ad budgets adjusted. If fat was the story, sugar could frame itself as the solution. Low fat, great taste. The same ad agencies that once sold puffs of smoke now sold bursts of sweetness under a health halo. Copywriters learned a new cadence: lean, fit, balanced, paired with product shots that shimmered. Grocery aisles became a maze where absence looked like virtue and sweet filled the space left behind. Back in academic halls, dissent existed but sounded technical. Triglycerides, lipoproteins, insulin responses, hard cells next to a simple habit loop you could feel. Slump, sip, relief. It didn't translate well on TV. The visual language favored a clogged pipe with yellow fat, not a liver processing fructose. When a doctor warned about sugar, interviews spliced his caution beside shelves of low-fat snacks labeled smart choices. Viewers absorbed the juxtaposition. Worry about fat, relax about sweet. Corporate tables, reformulation meetings grew methodical. Teams ran blind taste panels, full fat versus low fat plus sugar. The charts told a simple story: palates preferred the sweetened version. Purchase intent rose when labels signaled low fat. Product managers didn't have to argue, the data made the choice. They changed recipes, then changed serving sizes to keep numbers tidy. A smaller serving with the same sugar looked gentler on the panel. Consumers saw per serving and felt safe. The pivot reshaped breakfasts first. Cereals got louder claims, milks got sweetened variants, fruit on the bottom yogurts turned into dessert bowls with health branding. Lunch brought low-fat dressings thickened with sugar. Dinner pulled in sauces that hid sweetness behind herbs and photos of fresh vegetables. The calorie math wasn't the focus, the virtue signaling was. If the package said you were making a good choice, the palate's demand didn't feel like a demand anymore. There were cracks. A few studies linked high sugar intake to elevated triglycerides and fatty liver patterns even in people who drank no alcohol. Dentists raised alarms about constant exposure as children now snacked through the day. But the overarching narrative, cut fat, absorbed those concerns. Advice shifted to brush more and exercise, moving the fix away from the label and into personal responsibility. The system that added sugar to stay palatable stayed untouched. Inside one company, a memo circulated with a new line: "Taste is non-negotiable." That sentence explained everything. If reducing fat hurt taste, sweet would repair it. If new guidelines scared shoppers, labels would comfort them. If reporters asked about sugar, spokespeople would redirect to balance, moderation, and active lifestyles. It was a full-court press without a single dramatic speech, just 1,000 small decisions that moved in the same direction. Consumers adapted. They learned to read low-fat as shorthand for healthy and trained their tongues to expect sweetness in foods where it hadn't lived a generation earlier. A jar of tomato sauce tasted odd without the extra sugar that rounded the acid. Plain yogurt seemed austere. Peanut butter that wasn't sweet felt off. What started as a policy shift ended as a palate shift, reinforced with every acceptable product that hit shelves. And while the debate over fat played out, another force gathered off stage. Cornfields stretched to the horizon, and a new sweetener, cheaper, consistent, easy to blend, was being refined in quiet facilities where enzymes did what boiling kettles never could. The market had a new tool, and policy was about to make it irresistible. To see how the taste of a nation changed, you have to leave the lab coats and follow the money into the corn. Cornfields, policy, and the rise of HFCS. While fat soaked up blame, the real shift took root in fields. Farm bills rewired incentives after mid-century price shocks, turning corn into America's most protected crop. Price supports and guaranteed loans made planting corn a safer bet than most alternatives. Surpluses weren't a problem, they were a business model. Grain elevators filled, futures markets hummed, and policy cushions smoothed bad seasons. If you wanted stability, you planted corn. In labs far from those fields, chemists pushed a different frontier. Wet milling broke corn into parts: starch, oil, protein, like a factory disassembling a car. Enzymes then went to work on the starch, first converting it to glucose, then reshaping some of that glucose into fructose. High fructose corn syrup wasn't discovered at a stove. It was engineered in columns and tanks by tweaking temperature, pH, and residence time. The breakthrough wasn't sweetness, it was reliability. Every tanker left the plant with a spec sheet. You could set your recipe too. Policy met chemistry at the loading dock. Sugar tariffs and quotas kept cane and beet prices elevated at home. Corn, on the other hand, enjoyed an artificial floor and heavy investment. The arithmetic for soda makers and bakers got simple. HFCS cost less, stayed liquid, blended easily, and didn't crystallize out in cold warehouses. Contracts flipped not with fanfare, but with spreadsheets. Within a few years, syrups labeled 42 and 55, shorthand for their fructose ratios, quietly displaced sacks of sugar in syrup rooms and bottling plants. The stakes were huge. Soda companies live on pennies per serving. Shave 1 cent off an ingredient in a billion servings and you've got a fortune. HFCS 55, roughly as sweet as sucrose, let them hold sweetness constant while cutting cost and extending shelf life. The switch didn't need a press release. Consumers kept tasting the same fizz and the same sweet. Procurement teams hit their target. That's how a nation's palate shifts. Not with a recipe card on a kitchen counter, but with a supplier agreement signed in a conference room. Manufacturers love the flexibility. Syrup pipes don't clog like sugar hoppers. Tankers pump straight into storage. You can fine-tune sweetness in real time, adjusting for fruit acidity or seasonal variation without dissolving crystals. That control let product developers smooth out week-to-week swings and hit that trained expectation every time. The same logic let HFCS slide into breads, condiments, yogurts, and snacks, not as a headline ingredient, but as the texture, the browning, the roundness that made panels nod and repeat intent climb. Meanwhile, corn acreage spread like a geometric proof. Midwest towns felt the boom. New combines on driveways, ethanol plants adding demand, co-ops upgrading tanks. Further south and in coastal cane regions, another story unfolded. Small cane towns struggled as quotas kept their product expensive and corporate buyers drifted. A mill that had anchored a community for generations posted shorter hours, then shut down. Trucks that once hauled cane stalks sat idle, while rail cars of syrup passed them on the highway. On shelves, HFCS arrived under aliases: corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, corn sugar when lobbyists could swing it, Front labels didn't highlight it, they didn't need to. Formulation made sure the taste profile didn't budge. In focus groups, people said the soda tasted the same, or maybe a little smoother. That was the point. Keep the ritual intact while the input changes under the hood. All this happened as diets grew more processed. A sauce here, a snack pack there, a healthy low-fat yogurt sweetened to compensate. Fructose-heavy inputs tilted meals toward sugars the liver handles differently, yet the transition felt invisible because the daily cues, branding, bubbles, the first cold sip, didn't change. The habit stayed stable while the chemistry shifted. A small scene explains the switch better than any flowchart. A plant manager stands on a catwalk above stainless tanks, clipboard in hand. The night shift verifies bricks, acidity, and fructose percentage. A tanker backs in with a hiss, connects a hose, and 20,000 gallons of syrup flow in without a grain spilled. Down the hall, bottling lines clatter. On a wall, a chart shows raw material variance over a year, almost flat. Flat lines are gold in manufacturing. They mean fewer surprises and more profit. Tariffs kept cane and beet sugar in the game, but tilted. When world prices dipped, domestic barriers held U.S. sugar higher. HFCS didn't need a tariff. It rode on domestic corn's policy cushion. Over time, this asymmetry shaped product portfolios. If a developer could choose between two sweeteners that tasted similar but one cut cost and stabilized supply, the meeting ended fast. Some buyers asked about health differences. The official line played it safe. Sugar is sugar. On paper, both sucrose and HFCS delivered glucose and fructose. In practice, liquid loaders and formulation flexibility made high-sugar products easier to manufacture and harder to escape. Consumers didn't chase crystals. They drank sweetness woven into almost everything poured or squeezed from a bottle. By the early 1980s, the map was redrawn. Soda switched almost entirely. Breads leaned in. Condiments followed. Even products that didn't need overt sweetness used HFCS for browning and mouthfeel. The path from cornfield to couch was now short and well-paved, with policy guardrails and processing plants as mile markers. The taste people expected every day had a new backbone, and it wasn't cane. What mattered next wasn't just cost curves. It was the brain. Liquid sugar flowed faster than old rituals and hit reward circuits with efficient regularity. To see why those contracts locked in habits, you have to leave the catwalk and open a skull, metaphorically, because the next layer is wiring, conditioning, and a bliss point you can tune with a dial. Sweet brain, dopamine, conditioning, and cravings. To see why those contracts locked in habits, you have to watch the brain do its bookkeeping. Sweetness signals fast energy. Your tongue sends a report, your gut confirms, your brain's reward circuit pays out a small burst of dopamine. Part good job, part do this again. It's ancient wiring built for ripe fruit after lean weeks. In an environment of constant availability, that same wiring becomes a loop. The loop starts simple: cue, routine, reward. That rhythm is sticky because it reduces uncertainty. Your brain loves a reliable fix. Afternoon slump, reach for something sweet, feel the lift. Repeat that pattern enough times and the cue itself starts releasing dopamine in anticipation. You don't need the cookie yet, you need the idea of the cookie. That anticipation tightens the habit until it runs on rails. The reward becomes as much about relief from craving as the taste itself. Manufacturers learn to amplify that loop with variability, micro-swings in intensity that train behavior faster than constant rewards. Not every sweet is equally sweet, and that matters. When a drink tastes a little sweeter than last time, or when one cookie has more chocolate swirl than the next, the brain gets a stronger teaching signal. Variable reinforcement trains behavior faster than constant rewards. It's why slot machines keep players seated. In food, slight shifts in intensity keep a palate curious and a hand moving. There's a second shift that unfolds slowly. The bliss point creeps, dragging normal with it and making yesterday's treat today's baseline. The bliss point is the level of sweetness where a product tastes best. Hit it and a food lights up, miss it and it's dull or cloying. Over time, repeated high-sweet exposure pushes that point upward. A yogurt that tasted perfect at 8 grams of sugar per serving 10 years ago might taste flat to the same person today unless it's at 10 or 12. The baseline moves, and with it, the definition of normal. A small, quiet scene plays out in a living room. A night snacker settles onto a couch after dishes, turns on a show, and opens a pack of cookies. The first night is impulsive, a treat. By the 5th night, the couch itself becomes the cue. The cushion, the remote, the theme song, each piece triggers a micro spike of anticipation. The cookie delivers the relief. A week later, the craving arrives before the credits roll. The couch and cookies are now paired. Liquid sugar supercharges that process. Chewing slows intake and gives satiety signals time to rise. Drinking bypasses some of that friction. Calories enter fast, the stomach doesn't stretch much, the body's full metrics respond late. Meanwhile, sweetness at cold temperatures, think sodas, needs higher intensity to taste right, which means each sip delivers a robust signal. The result is efficient, large, quick doses that the brain counts as significant learning event. This is where addiction language gets debated. Sugar doesn't intoxicate like alcohol. It doesn't produce the motor impairment or stupor people associate with classic drugs. But addiction-like patterns show up. Binge behavior, cravings triggered by cues, withdrawal-like irritability when a routine breaks, and persistent use despite dental or metabolic consequences. Some animal studies have mapped dopamine and opioid signaling changes during sugar binging and deprivation cycle. In humans, the picture is messier, but the behavior rhymes. Another layer lives in the gut-brain conversation, expectation versus delivery. When sweet stops predicting calories, regulation stumbles and cravings stretch into the next meal. Sweetness predicts calories, the body learns that relationship. When the sweetness-calorie link is consistent, the brain calibrates hunger and fullness around it. When the link becomes erratic, very sweet things with different calorie loads, appetite regulation wobbles. Some studies suggest that unpredictable pairing can make people eat more later, as the brain corrects for uncertainty with a wider safety margin. The practical effect: craving stays alive even after a sweet hit. Palates don't shift in isolation. Environments sculpt them. Availability, visibility, and timing do as much work as taste. If the first foods children taste lean sweet, pouches, flavored milks, fruit on the bottom yogurts, vegetables register as punishment food. Repeated exposure can retrain taste back towards sour and bitter, but the path is uphill when every third package offers a quick dopamine ping. Dinner tables become negotiations not because broccoli is impossible, but because the bliss point is set elsewhere. Meanwhile, metabolism lends its own reinforcement. Rapidly absorbed sugars can spike glucose, then insulin. A quick rise, a corrective dip. That dip feels like fatigue or irritability, another cue. The brain remembers what fixed that feeling last time and suggests it again. You're not weak. You're following an efficient internal algorithm designed to reduce discomfort with the fastest available tool. Consider the office kitchenette. Someone leaves a box of glazed donuts on Friday mornings. The first week, half the team eats one. By week 3, someone checks the box by 9 a.m. just to see. By week 5, a few people glance toward the counter every time they pass the door. The box isn't just a box, it's a conditioned object. Even empty, it pulls attention. When it is full, the dopamine hit starts before the lid opens. The most unsettling part is how easily the loop scales across a day. Stacked cues create a feedback net that catches you at every slump. Sweet coffee in the morning, sweetened yogurt mid-morning, ketchup at lunch, a soda in the afternoon, a sauce at dinner, ice cream late. No moment is extreme, but together they set a constant background hum of reinforcement. The bliss point stays calibrated. The cue web grows denser. The idea of unsweet drifts toward broken. None of this required a mastermind plan to hijack brains. It required an industry tuned to what sells and a biology tuned to survive scarcity. Those two systems met in a marketplace with near-zero friction, and the result looked like inevitability. Then someone noticed something else. The bliss point isn't fixed by nature. It can be engineered, mapped, and optimized, product by product, age group by age group. And once you can tune the dial, you can decide where normal lives. Engineers of crave, bliss point, and product design. Here's where the story stops being accidental. A market researcher named Howard Moscovitz started treating taste like a landscape you could survey. He didn't ask, do people like this? He asked, where do they like it most? That peak, the precise level where sweetness lights up the mouth without tipping into syrupy, became the bliss point. Not a guess, a measurement. Every category had its own hill. Yogurt, pasta sauce, soda, kids' cereal. Find the hill, plant your flag, defend it. The method looked clinical. Recruit hundreds of tasters. Prepare dozens, sometimes hundreds of slightly different formulations. More sweet, less sweet, adjusted acidity, tweaked aroma. Run blinded tests, record preference curves, and watch as a bell shape emerges. Too little sweetness, low scores. Too much, scores fall again. Right in the middle, the peak. That's your target. Then you build guardrails around it so every bottle or box hits that same sweet spot, batch after batch. Companies loved the certainty. Instead of arguing in conference rooms, they pointed at graphs. If 8 grams per serving won the panel, 8 grams became law. If a little extra vanilla Q nudged perceived sweetness higher without adding sugar, R&D took the win. Aroma became a lever, mouthfeel another, temperature and bubbles too. Cold dulls sweetness, so sodas pushed higher to taste right out of the fridge. Effervescence lifts aroma into the nose, boosting perceived intensity. Every variable turned into a knob. Kids' cereals became a battlefield. The goal wasn't just taste, it was displacement. If a bowl could outcompete eggs or oatmeal on preference and convenience, breakfast changed. Panels of children sampled spoon after spoon, rating crunch, sweetness, and that milk after effect. The winning formulas delivered instant pleasure, stayed crunchy in milk just long enough, and left a sweetened milk treat at the bottom, another reward built into the ritual. Parents saw smiles, brands saw a beachhead. Inside companies, a phrase drove strategy. Heavy users drive sales, so products and placements were tuned to protect their Q webs. The top quintile of customers could account for a huge share of volume. Keep them engaged and your quarterly line stayed smooth. That logic shaped portfolios. You didn't launch one great product, you launched families, regular, cherry, vanilla, zero, seasonal variants, so taste fatigue never had a chance. If boredom loomed, a limited edition arrived to reset curiosity without lowering the baseline. A micro story from a test kitchen explains the stakes. 2 cereal prototypes sit side by side. One has 10 grams of sugar per serving, the other 11. The room splits. Sensory data says the 11-gram version gets a small lift in overall liking among core users, and kids rate its first bite higher. The health team argues for 10. The brand lead asks one question: what happens to repeat intent in week 6? The chart favors 11. The decision is made. 1 gram, millions of boxes. Bliss Points weren't universal. Pasta sauce lived on a different hill than soda. But in the 199s, some mass-market sauces quietly crept sweeter to soften acidity and boost family appeal. Taste panels didn't call it sweet. They called it rounded or restaurant style. Those words signaled success. If the spoon test in a suburban kitchen got a nod, the label had its permission slip. Meanwhile, the back label kept numbers small with tight serving sizes. Per quarter cup, it looked tame. Engineering didn't stop at sugar. Fat and salt joined the matrix. The trifecta sweet, fat, salt hit overlapping reward pathways, giving developers room to juggle. Drop fat, nudge sweetness, and add a hint of salt to brighten it. Need to shave sugar, layer vanilla aroma, and tweak mouthfeel with hydrocolloids. The tongue reads texture and smell as part of taste. If you can mimic indulgence, you can hold preference scores while trimming cost or dodging a headline. Portfolio strategy protected the Bliss Point across time. Rotating novelty kept dopamine interested without lowering the peak. Seasonal drops reset excitement. New formats, mini cans, resealable pouches, managed pace of intake while increasing frequency. A smaller can made a second can feel reasonable. Multipacks increased household availability, raising the odds that a craving met a solution within 10 steps. Distribution became part of design. Front-of-store coolers, end caps at eye level, tie-ins with salty snacks to cross-trigger appetite. Labels and claims wrapped the engineering in reassurance. No high fructose corn syrup might sit on the front while sugar held the same spot in the recipe. Natural flavors boosted perceived sweetness. Made with real fruit covered concentrates. Sensory wins came first. Language followed to keep doubts quiet. If the first sip landed right, the rest was paperwork. One more lever mattered: price tiers. Premium lines with less sugar or simple ingredients sat next to core products. They kept skeptical shoppers in the brand family without lowering the main line's Bliss Point. If those buyers came back on holidays or tough weeks, the core product greeted them at the exact intensity their memory wanted. Nostalgia is a powerful co-designer. Over time, this system built an ecosystem around the Bliss Point. R&D optimized for preference peaks. Marketing protected those peaks with stories. Sales placed them where habits lived. Operations delivered relentless consistency. Nobody had to say, make it addictive. They said, hit the target, reduce churn, maximize repeat. The brain did the rest. Meanwhile, guardrails fell softly. School parties normalized cupcakes. Office fridges stocked singles. Gas stations upgraded coolers to make cold sweeter and more available. Each tweak kept the Bliss Point fed with fresh context, fresh cues, and fewer obstacles. Engineering didn't just tune products, it tuned environments. And when critics pressed, companies reached for moderation, talking points and alternative lines to prove they listened. But the flagship stayed on its hill. calibrated to the exact spot where just one more feels reasonable until the box is quiet and the couch cue resets for tomorrow. Labels, lobbying, and the language of sweet. Once the Bliss Point was engineered, the label had to make it feel safe. Front panels put on halos, natural, wholesome, made with real fruit. The sugar lived on the back in small print, sometimes split across aliases, evaporated cane juice, dextrose, maltose, fruit concentrate, so no single line screamed. Serving sizes helped too. Shrink a portion and the grams drop per serving, even if the package still invites a full pour. The first glance said better. The fine print said sweet. Natural did a lot of lifting. It suggested fields and orchards, not factories and refineries. If a product replaced high fructose corn syrup with cane sugar, the front declared victory. Never mind that sweetness and calories landed the same. No HFCS became a badge, while sugar slipped into the slot HFCS vacated. For a shopper trying to do the right thing in 30 seconds, those words mattered more than metabolic pathways. Language became another knob. Design worked the aisle from both ends, front panel halos to disarm scrutiny, back panel math to normalize daily exposure. Big claims up front, tiny numerals in back, and color palettes tuned to health, greens, browns, matte textures. Photos of berries gave cover to concentrates that delivered sweetness without the fiber that slows it. If a recipe used apple juice concentrate to sweeten bars, the ingredient list could say fruit. The mouth still got sugar, the mind got virtue. It wasn't a lie. It was a framing. Fights over disclosure stretched for years. Public health advocates pushed for added sugars to be called out separately from sugars naturally present in fruit or milk. Industry groups argued cost, confusion, and freedom of choice. Meetings stacked with comments and counter-analyses debated how a label should show sweetness. When added sugars finally landed on nutrition facts, it brought a number and a percent of daily value, plain, unadorned. But by then, habits were decades old, and labels don't retrain tongues overnight. While regulation crept forward, city halls turned to taxes. Soda taxes appeared on ballots from Berkeley to Philadelphia to Mexico City's neighbor cities. Each proposal turned into a referendum on freedom, jobs, and fairness. Campaigns rolled out glossy mailers warning of regressive costs on working families and small businesses. Others pointed to revenue for schools and clinics, or to early data showing lower sales and higher water purchases. On election night, results mixed. Some cities passed levies, others rejected them after record spending on ads. Courtrooms joined the story. Preemption bills appeared at state legislatures, blocking cities from taxing sugary drinks. Industry coalitions presented it as uniform policy to help businesses plan. Mayors called it handcuffs. If a tax did pass, formulations shifted. A manufacturer might shave a few grams per serving to dodge a higher tier, then add sweeteners to hold the taste line. Policy nudged, R&D absorbed, the can still delivered its promise. Sports sponsorships blurred the message further. Jerseys and scoreboards paired sugar with performance. Halftime shows tossed shirts and cold bottles to roaring crowds. A kid saw heroes sprint and dunk under banners with bubbles and ice. The association did its quiet work: energy, victory, celebration. Even when teams added water sponsors, the tradition stuck. Victory baths with sweet were part of the theater, a ritual replayed on highlight reels. Microstories unfolded in stores, minute-by-minute nudges that lean on heuristics like natural, light, and smaller packages to signal safety. A parent in a rush grabbed the box that said no artificial sweeteners, thinking it meant less sweet. It didn't. It meant the sugar was conventional. Another shopper picked a granola labeled lightly sweetened and missed the serving size math, 2/3 of a cup, not the bowl they planned to fill. The words were true. The impression leaned softer than the spoon would taste at home. Lobbying didn't just defend, it shaped language. Petitions asked regulators to let corn sugar replace high fructose corn syrup, arguing clarity. Critics called it a disguise. Trade groups funded community programs and nutrition initiatives, foregrounding balance and activity. School districts received grants for sports equipment, while vending contracts filled hallways with cold options at eye level. A coach told kids to hydrate, pointing at a cooler with brand logos they'd seen on TV after championships. When added sugars finally arrived on labels, some brands pivoted to smaller cans and mini packs. The units looked responsible, the price per ounce climbed. For heavy users, multi-packs sat next to minis, offering economy and convenience. For cautious buyers, less sugar lines appeared, sometimes sweetened with stevia or sucralose to keep the Bliss Point alive. The flagship formula stayed put, defended by nostalgia and habit. Meanwhile, influencers and wellness trends supplied cover stories. Unrefined sugar, coconut sugar, raw honey, substitutions that changed origin and color more than outcome. Recipes online promised no sugar brownies made with dates, then blended concentrates delivered near-identical loads. The palate shifted to earth tones and mason jars. The dopamine didn't care. Sweet by any other name still hit. Consumer confusion wasn't an accident. It was a system outcome. Labels optimized for compliance and persuasion, ads for emotion, lobbying for favorable rules, sponsorships for cultural legitimacy. Put together, the language of sweet turned critique into noise. If you wanted to cut back, you needed time, literacy, and a willingness to swim upstream in every aisle. Most people had dinner to make. And under those words, the body kept the ledger. Teeth tracked exposure. Livers handled fructose. Blood sugar rode little waves all day. The next aisle over, someone grabbed a sports drink after a cardio class, convinced it was part of recovery. The bottle read electrolytes. The tongue read sweet. The label spoke a dialect built over decades, designed to reassure. The bill would show up later in places labels never visit. The body bill, metabolic fallout in real lives. Walk into a clinic on a Tuesday and watch the quiet math. A nurse wraps a cuff, a glucometer beeps, a teenager shifts on paper crinkling over vinyl. He runs track, drinks low-fat chocolate milk, grabs fruit on the bottom yogurt, keeps a sports drink in his backpack because practice runs long. His A1C comes back high, prediabetes. He stares at the number like it's a prank. He did what the labels told him to do. The sweetness hid in healthy. Inside his body, fructose took a different path. Unlike glucose, which spreads to muscles and tissues, fructose heads straight to the liver. In small doses, the liver turns it into glycogen. With repeated large liquid hits, sodas, juices, sweetened milks, the liver starts converting more to fat. Drop by drop, that fat can accumulate inside liver cells, a slow, quiet build known as non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. You can have it without touching alcohol. Many do. Sleep starts to wobble. On nights when the last sweet lands late, he falls asleep fast, wakes restless, craves something quick at dawn. Mood tracks intake. High days feel buzzy, low days feel gray. Energy swings become background noise he calls busy. Teachers see attention drift after lunch. Coaches chalk it up to stress. The loop reads like life until a lab slip says otherwise. At home, his mother juggles costs. The doctor wants a follow-up, a nutrition consult, maybe a continuous glucose monitor for a month. The insurance copay crowds the grocery budget. She stands in an aisle doing triage. The plain yogurt nobody likes, the flavored one everyone will eat. The unsweetened cereal that gets left, the honeyed one that vanishes, the bulk bottle that saves a few dollars even if it adds a few teaspoons per serving. She's not choosing indulgent. She's choosing compliance with what the family will actually swallow. Dentists carry their own ledger. In low-income neighborhoods, clinics see children with cavities in baby teeth and permanent teeth, sometimes both in the same mouth. Soda is cheaper per smile than fresh fruit per day. A 2-liter sits cold in the fridge because it stretches and the fizz feels like joy. Parents know about brushing. They also know about payday. An emergency extraction happens between shift. A kid leaves with gauze and a sticker, holding a promise to avoid sweets, while a convenience store sits across the street with a deal on bright bottle. Meanwhile, an older woman stirs sweet tea on a Sunday the way her mother taught her. Her doctor warned her about her blood sugar last month. She hears the warning and hears her mother in the same breath. Family gathers, glasses clink. She pours with a steady hand, then pauses, adds a little water to her own glass. It tastes thin. She squeezes a lemon to make the thin taste intentional, more tart, not less sweet. It's a small adjustment that keeps the ritual intact while she tries to nudge her tongue. In another kitchen, a father reads no high fructose corn syrup and feels relief. He doesn't notice the sugar grams, the serving size, the fact that each spoonful delivers the same load through a different name. After dinner, he reaches for the ketchup again because it smooths the plate's edges, because everyone eats more when the sauce tastes friendly. The bottle quietly maintains the family's baseline. The teenager with prediabetes starts wearing a monitor for 2 weeks. He learns that his healthy yogurt spikes him harder than eggs. He switches to water at practice and feels sluggish for 3 days, then steadies. The vending machine in the hallway hums like a siren until he stops walking past it. He isn't cured, he's measuring. A friend jokes that he's old now, counting numbers. He laughs, then looks at the graph on his phone during lunch, taps the screen, and watches the line flatten after a boring sandwich. None of this is neat. Healthcare costs don't show up as receipts labeled sugar. They show up as lost hours at work for appointments, as prescriptions that squeeze budgets, as choices made in fluorescent light among boxes that promise energy, balance, and real fruit. The body keeps its own books: triglycerides rising, liver enzymes edging up, enamel thinning. A clinic social worker runs a class on reading labels. She tells a room that a bottle is 2.5 servings, not 1. A man raises his eyebrows and holds the bottle like it lied to him. A mother snaps a photo of a slide showing added sugars and sends it to her sister. After class, they walk past a store window stacked with minis in bright rows. Smaller looks safer. It also looks easy to grab too. In families, debates play out at tables. A child asks for the cereal with the cartoon. A parent pulls out the plain one and promises berries on top. The compromise tastes almost right by day 4. Habits bend when environments change, but environments fight back. Birthday cupcakes at school, protein bars that taste like candy, recovery drinks at the gym, free refills at pizza night. These stories aren't about weak will. They're about friction and the way micro-frictions, eye level, cold placement, default sizes, shape behavior more than intentions. It's easier to maintain a Bliss Point than to retrain one. It's easier to buy the box that quiets a morning argument than to risk a skipped breakfast. Bodies pay in slow installments. A liver storing fat, a pancreas working harder, a mood that needs a lift at 3, a molar that aches, a bill from a clinic, a note from a dentist, a graph that trembles until the environment shifts. Countermoves, chefs, parents, and policy rebels. Pushback started with small, stubborn choices. In a school cafeteria, a principal stood over crates of chocolate milk and asked why a lunch meant to teach health ended with a sugar chaser. The district piloted a switch: plain milk, water, fruit. First week, kids grumbled and dumped cartons. Third week, they drank. The noise faded faster than adults expected. A vending contract came up next. The new bid removed full sugar sodas near classrooms, pushed water to eye level, and timed machines off during the first hours after lunch, so kids couldn't turn a blood sugar dip into a habit. Chefs attacked the Bliss Point at the stove. In a hospital kitchen, a team rewrote sauces. Tomatoes held their acidity, onions carried sweetness through slow cooking, not added sugar, dressings leaned on lemon and mustard instead of syrup. At first, patients sent plates back half-eaten. The chefs held the line and retrained with salt, fat, acid, and bitter. A month in, survey cards shifted. Words like fresh and bright replaced bland. A pediatrician started sending families downstairs to taste vegetables treated like main characters, instead of problems to solve with glaze. A middle school cooking class became a lab for palate rehab. Kids learned to taste sour on purpose: grapefruit, yogurt, quick-pickled cucumbers. A teacher asked them to name flavors, then add a pinch of salt and taste again. Faces changed. "It's sweeter," one kid said, even though no sugar touched the plate. That sentence cracked something open. If seasoning made things taste sweeter, maybe sugar wasn't the only road to good. Parents fought smaller battles at home. One mother swapped flavored yogurt for plain with mashed berries and a drizzle of honey, cutting total sweet, but keeping the pink swirl a child expected. A father moved the cereal from an easy shelf to a bin that required a step stool, putting eggs and fruit at eye level. When morning rush returned old habits, he added one rule: weekend sweet cereal, weekdays not. The rule stuck because the calendar did the work. Willpower became scheduling. Policy started writing these tweaks into buildings. Some districts banned soda in vending, others tightened fundraisers so classrooms didn't turn into candy kiosks. Backlash came fast, teams needed money. A city passed a small soda tax, earmarking revenue for clinics and park upgrades. Corner stores took the hit and grumbled. Then a clinic opened a Saturday label reading class funded by that tax, and a park fixed its lights. Water stations appeared near field. The link between a line item on a receipt and a lit basketball court wasn't obvious, but kids noticed the court. Industry adapted with quiet reformulation and louder marketing. A cereal dropped 1 gram of sugar per serving and launched an ad about now with less. The font shouting 12 grams didn't mention the serving size got smaller. A beverage company rolled out mini cans that looked responsible and priced them to normalize buying too. Corporate spokespeople repeated the word choice. In practice, they protected cues. Same shelf space, same cold placement, same tie-ins at checkout. Chefs kept pressing. A school district hired one to rework menus across 20 campuses. He paired bitter with fat, broccoli with olive oil and salt, not steam and apology. He taught staff to roast carrots until their natural sugars surfaced, then stop. The first parent night brought skeptics who tried a chickpea salad expecting punishment and nodded, surprised. The chef didn't ban sweet, he localized it. Dessert returned to a place after dinner, not inside dinner. Grassroots groups used data as a crowbar. In one city, advocates tracked sales before and after a soda tax, then measured water purchases. They published graphs that didn't preach, they plotted lines. The lines showed a dip in soda, a lift in water. Clinics reported fewer extreme blood sugar spikes in ER visits on hot days. The pattern wasn't a cure, it was a nudge at population scale. The next referendum had a new talking point that wasn't theory, it was last summer. At home, a parent coalition tackled birthday culture. They proposed a swap, one shared dessert per month instead of 12 personal cupcakes per class. Teachers exhaled, kids still ate cake. The calendar did the trimming again. A coach replaced sugary post-game drinks with cold water and orange slices, bracing for revolt. It didn't come. The wind took care of mood, the cold took care of thirst. None of these moves broke the loop alone, but each added friction where none existed before, exactly how you decondition a cue. Reduce exposure, slow access, and give the brain a new, predictable path to relief. When environments change, habits follow, slower than ad campaigns, faster than metabolism. Industry adjusted, shaved grams, planted new slogans. Parents and chefs took back ground one pantry, one menu, one contract at a time. The question lingered, were substitutes going to help, or would they keep the craving alive under new names? The sweet detour, diet drinks, sugar alcohols, and new tricks. When pushback grew louder, the market pivoted without losing the plot. Sweet without calories sounded like a loophole you could live in. Cans turned silver and black, labels added the word diet, and the pitch shifted from fuel to freedom. Keep the ritual, skip the guilt. The first sip still snapped cold. The bubbles still lifted aroma. The Bliss Point stayed put, only the molecule changed. Artificial sweeteners promised precision. Saccharin started the story, aspartame scaled it, sucralose hardened it for heat and shelf life, then stevia and monk fruit arrived with a natural halo. Each one brought an intensity far beyond sugar, sometimes hundreds of times sweeter. That power let companies use microdoses to hit the same perceived sweetness with near zero calories. Formulators adjusted acids and flavors to soften bitter tails, then taught panels to nod. On paper, it worked. Sweetness without the metabolic cost. In real lives, the ledger got complicated. Some people swapped soda for diet and lost weight, others didn't. Appetite doesn't run strictly on arithmetic. The brain had learned that sweet signals calories. When sweetness arrives without calories, some studies suggest regulation stumbles. The body looks for the missing energy later. Not everyone responds the same way, and data are mixed. But in behavior, a common pattern showed up. A diet drink at lunch earned an extra dessert at dinner. Net intake stayed put. Gut stories added another wrinkle. Research explored how some sweeteners might shift gut microbes or nudge insulin responses in ways that vary by person. The science didn't add up to a simple villain, but it erased the fantasy of consequence-free sweetness. People aren't lab mice, and a Tuesday includes sleep debt, stress, and meeting donuts. In that noise, diet swaps sometimes helped, sometimes did nothing, sometimes fed the craving without fixing the habit. Sugar alcohols, xylitol, erythritol, sorbitol offered a middle road. They tasted sweet with fewer calories because the body only partially absorbed them. Chewing gum used them to protect teeth. Some candies used them to dodge sugar on labels. The trade-off lived in stomachs. Eat too much and you get cramps or a quick walk to the bathroom. Packages hid warnings in fine print. Consumers learned limits the hard way and joked about it, then kept buying because the promise almost worked. Natural sweeteners became the next costume change. Stevia leaf and monk fruit extract appeared on front panels with leaves and fruit drawn in soft lines. Behind the leaf was a refinery path. Isolate intensely sweet compounds, mask the aftertaste, blend with sugar or sugar alcohols to feel more like the real thing. A no added sugar, ice cream could taste like the old scoop by mixing multiple sweeteners and thickeners. The mouth smiled, the label complied. A human moment captures the trap. A man quits regular soda after a scare at a checkup. He shifts to diet, then notices desserts pulling harder. The deal he made with himself, skip calories in the can, allow them on the plate, keeps his total steady. He tells friends he's off soda and believes it. He is. He just moved the sweet from sips to bites. Ultra-processed, keto sweets push the pattern further. Bars with net carbs subtracted fiber and sugar alcohols on the back panel, then stacked sweeteners to hit the Bliss Point on the front. They lit up reward circuits and trained palates to expect dessert at noon while preserving a diet identity. For people who needed a bridge away from sugar, they were useful. For people who needed to relearn unsweet, they delayed the work. Manufacturers knew how to defend both flanks. For heavy users, core products stayed loud and consistent. For cautious users, zero and no sugar added lines kept them in the family. A portfolio could meet you wherever your willpower stood that week. If you tried to cut back, a smaller can waited. If you tried to quit, a zero sugar version held your hand. Either way, cues stayed in place. Cold placement, bright colors, the hiss of a tab at 3 p.m. Not everyone got stuck. Some used diet drinks as a ramp, 2 weeks on, then seltzer with a splash of juice, then water, gradual exposure that rewires the Bliss Point without triggering rebound. Others switched their sweet to coffee and kept sliding. Habits are architecture. If the environment gives you a ladder, you can climb. If the kitchen keeps sweet at eye level, you pause halfway and camp there. The detour taught a blunt lesson. Changing molecules isn't the same as changing patterns. You can mute calories and keep the craving loud. You can rename ingredients and leave the cue untouched. Until policy and design shift the default, the easiest path still runs straight through sweet. One country decided to move the road. Global case studies. When policy changes taste. Start in Mexico, where soda is culture and convenience. In 2014, a nationwide tax landed, 1 peso per liter on sugary drinks. It sounded small, but registers noticed. In the first year, sales dipped, especially among heavy buyers. By the second, water sales rose. Corner shops began stacking refillable jugs near the door, and street vendors added big blue coolers of agua fresca that leaned more on fruit and less on sugar. At family tables, mothers stretched pitchers with extra water and lime. Kids complained the first week, then stopped. The cups kept clinking, the sweetness ratcheted down. Walk into a Puebla tienda and watch a choice change. A boy reaches for a cold bottle, pauses, and grabs a cheaper, smaller size. His sister takes a chilled water because her school started praising litros de agua on posters. None of it feels like moral reform. It feels like prices and cues shifting in tiny increments that add up. On Sunday, their uncle still brings soda to the cookout. He brings 1 2-liter instead of 2 and sets out cups next to a new stack of reusable water bottles. The habit bends without snapping. Fly south along the Andes, then swing west to Chile. In 2016, thick black stop signs started appearing on packages. High in sugar, high in calories, high in sodium. No cartoon mascots on the fronts of products that carried those warnings, no ads to children for them either. The labels weren't shy, they were confrontational. In supermarkets, parents felt a jolt seeing a breakfast box flagged like a hazard. Kids reached for characters, found none on the sweetest boxes, and drifted a shelf over. Purchases shifted. Companies trimmed formulas to dodge extra labels, pairing sugar just enough to move a product below a threshold. A mother in Santiago described it this way to a friend: "I don't have to argue, the box is arguing for me." That mattered at 7 a.m. when time was short. Over months, pantries recalibrated. Yogurts lost some sweetness. Juices shrank portions. Cereals muted their glow. The policy didn't ban dessert. It dragged the everyday back toward plain. Taste followed. A child who got used to less sweet cereal stopped adding extra spoonfuls of table sugar on top. The mouth adjusted. Because the shelf had fewer high-sugar bullhorns. Now to the UK, where a tiered levy arrived in 2018. It didn't tax all sugary drinks equally. It set bans. Above 5 grams of sugar per 100 milliliters, one rate. Above 8 grams, a higher one. The point wasn't just revenue, it was leverage. Manufacturers stared at spreadsheets and reformulated. Many big brands shaved sugar to slip under a tier, tweaking acids, flavors, and carbonation to maintain the hit without paying the top rate. Shelves didn't empty, recipes moved. Consumers kept buying familiar cans that whispered a slightly different sweetness. That whisper, multiplied across millions of sips, nudged a national Bliss Point down a notch. A Manchester corner shop owner felt the shift in delivery invoices before he felt it in his till. Cases arrived with new labels and small print about grams per 100 ml. He rearranged his fridge, giving water Rose the space once reserved for full sugar liters. After school, kids used to swarm the coldest shelf. They still did, but more hands grabbed mid-tier drinks and plain water when prices favored them. He noticed fewer empty full sugar bottles in the bin outside. The bin didn't moralize, it testified. Across these countries, a pattern repeated. Design follows policy and palates follow design. Shift the default, shift the desire. Taxes moved price anchors, warning labels changed social cues, tiered levies forced reformulation behind the scenes. None of it relied on individual will at a checkout line. It shifted defaults upstream so the easy choice came with less sugar baked in. Over time, palates drifted. What tasted right in 2013 tasted a bit too much by 2019. The same people, the same brands, a slightly different target. Critics pointed out leaks, the untaxed sweet tea powders, the candies that never wore labels, the marketing that jumped to digital. They weren't wrong. No policy seals every door, but the direction of travel changed, which gave parents and schools a tailwind. In Mexico, bottled water companies expanded aggressively. In Chile, characters migrated to lower sugar lines. In the UK, the headlines were about reformulation more than rebellion. Industry proved what it always claims. It can give people what they'll buy. When rules redraw the lane lines, recipes follow. Back at our corner shop, the owner counts coins at closing and looks at the water shelf he used to ignore. It's half empty. He orders more. He keeps a few full sugar favorites for loyal customers, but the balance tips. A kid walks in, points at a tub of sweets, then glances at the fridge, shrugs, and takes a cold bottle. The shrug is the point. Habit can lose sugar without turning into a fight. Policy wrote one chapter. Taste started writing the next. The reveal: sugar didn't become a drug by accident. Stand back from the timeline and the pieces line up. Sweetness didn't simply flood our lives because tastes changed. It was directed. Marketing taught rituals. Science, selectively funded and amplified, directed blame toward fat. Policy made a cheaper sweetener the rational choice. Product design tuned pleasure to a measurable peak and defended it with consistency. Each layer reinforced the next until normal meant sweet by default. Start with intent you can trace. The industry learned early that habit beats novelty. Internal tracking focused on craving cycles and heavy users, the customers whose repeat purchases stabilized revenue. When low-fat guidelines arrived, reformulation didn't lower the overall pull. It swapped fat for sugar to keep the experience intact. The palate felt cared for, the spreadsheet smiled. That wasn't an accident. It was a design constraint. Taste is non-negotiable. Policy pressure didn't break the loop, it rerouted it. Sugar tariffs and quotas held domestic prices high, while corn policy made HFCS cheap and predictable. Procurement departments did the math. The switch to liquid sugars made sweetness easier to weave into everything poured or squeezed. That logistical ease, hoses and tanks instead of sacks and dissolvers, wasn't just efficiency. It lowered friction at every point where a developer could say, add a little. Meanwhile, marketing translated all of this into stories. Quick energy morphed into low-fat and delicious, then into no HFCS, then natural. Labels managed perception while formulations hugged the Bliss Point. Sponsorships attached sugar to performance and celebration. If you saw a jersey, a halftime, a medal, you saw bubbles, frosting, or a squeezed bottle. Those images rewired feelings about what sweet meant in public. It wasn't indulgence, it was participation. The science isn't a single smoking memo, but there were choices with fingerprints. Funding flowed to questions that made fat the headline risk. Reviews downplayed sugar's role in heart disease or called for more study. That bought time. Time to reformulate, time to train palates, time to build brands on the foundation that fat was the danger and sweet the solution. By the time added sugars got their own line on labels, the environment had already finished its training program. Then came the engineering revolution. Moscovitz and others mapped preference with the rigor of ballistics. Bliss points by category, by age, by format. The data let companies defend sweetness precisely enough to preserve repeat intent without triggering cloying fatigue. When variants threatened boredom, portfolios expanded. Seasonal flavors refreshed interest. Mini sizes normalized multiple servings. The goal wasn't a single knockout. It was a reliable cadence of small wins that kept the loop humming. All of it would have meant less if biology didn't cooperate. Reward circuits responded predictably to fast, frequent, and variable sweet. Liquid sugars turned the knob further by compressing the time between cue, consumption, and reward. The gut-brain loop adapted to an environment it never evolved to expect, and craving turned into a quiet operating system for the day. The more often products met the craving at the same intensity, the deeper the rut. Here's the full-circle moment we planted at the start. As tobacco lost its cultural license, buyers, agencies, and media space didn't evaporate. Budgets moved. The playbook moved with them. Target heavy users, sponsor culture, sell relief, defend routine, argue moderation, discredit critics as killjoys or confused. Sugar didn't need smoke to use smoke's tactics. It needed consistency, placement, and time. This system rewards addiction-like consumption without needing the word. Sales bonuses rise with frequency and volume. Shelf fees favor brands that move fast. Vending contracts pay for exclusivity. If a product delivers a tiny rush and the environment keeps it within arm's reach, the path of least resistance becomes the business model. That's the design. Not a villain's monologue, but a mesh of incentives that points toward the same outcome. Personal agency still matters, but it isn't evenly distributed. Some households have time to read labels, money to try new products, kitchens that make unsweet taste good. Others navigate shift work, stress, and aisles wired for speed. The system's friction runs one way. If you want more sweet, there are 1,000 easy doors. If you want less, you need a plan. But the same system can bend. When policy changes prices or labels, design follows. When schools and chefs shift defaults, taste recalibrates. When parents move products out of line, kids adapt faster than adults expect. The brain that learned to love high bliss points can learn lower ones, given time and repetition. The habit doesn't start with you. It starts with what's offered, where and how often. Cues craft cravings long before choices feel personal. Change the offering and the pattern follows. That's the reveal. Sugar didn't become a drug by accident. It became a daily relief ritual because a network made it easy, pleasant, and constant on purpose. The next choice isn't free-floating willpower. It's a decision inside an environment someone designed. Change the environment, and the craving loses home field advantage. The sweeter food got, the duller everything else tasted, because we trained our tongues to crave what an industry optimized. If this shifted how you see your pantry and the stories on your labels, subscribe for more untold histories shaping everyday choices. Now watch our deep dive on how your credit score quietly scripts your life and opportunities. The next sip is a decision, but remember, the menu, the shelf, and the ad helped write it. Let's be clear about the ground we're standing on. Everything you've heard rests on sources we can point to: policy documents, peer-reviewed studies, archival ads, and industry papers, plus places where the data are strong but the interpretation is contested. Well, call the line as we cross it. On marketing and the Bliss Point, the public record includes interviews with product developers and consumer research literature describing preference mapping across categories. The term itself is widely attributed to work by market researchers like Howard Moskowitz and contemporaries who ran large-end taste tests to chart sweetness curves. What's solid? Companies measured and targeted preference peaks, then standardized products to those targets. What's harder to quantify? The exact internal thresholds brand by brand, because not every memo is public. On the Fat Pivot, we rely on published historical analyses of industry, funding for heart disease research in the 196s and the subsequent media framing. The documentation shows payments, editorial influence on the scope of review, and the emphasis on saturated fat in high-visibility outlets. What's firm? The funding, the slant, the downstream amplification. What remains debated? How much that slant alone shaped national guidelines versus parallel scientific currents and policymaker incentives. On corn policy and HFCS, farm bills, tariff schedules, and quota rules are public. The economic logic, corn subsidies and sugar protections making HFCS attractive, can be traced through government reports, trade data, and corporate procurement shifts visible in industry journals. What's solid? Timing and price incentives aligned with rapid adoption. What's tricky? Apportioning causation between cost, logistics, and product performance when companies rarely publish full decision trees. On labels and lobbying, agency dockets and comment letters record fights over added sugars, serving sizes, and naming conventions like corn sugar. City tax campaigns disclose expenditures. Court filings show preemption efforts. What's firm? The scale of spending and the strategies used. What's partial? Behind-the-scenes message testing and retailer placement deals that sit in private contract. On physiology and addiction, we need precision. Animal studies show sugar can trigger dopamine and opioid changes under binge access conditions and produce withdrawal-like behaviors. Human neuroimaging finds reward circuit activation to palatable foods, including sweet, with cue reactivity patterns that resemble other reinforced behaviors. That said, major reviews caution against a one-to-one sugar equals cocaine claim in human. There's no classic intoxication, and individual differences are large. Our footing, addiction-like features can emerge, cue-triggered craving, escalation, persistence despite harm, but the field debates labels and mechanisms. We flagged that as addiction-like rather than declaring sugar a drug in the clinical sense. On metabolic outcomes, associations between high added sugar intake, especially liquid, and risk markers like elevated triglycerides, insulin resistance, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease are supported by observational studies and short-term trials. Limits. Long-term randomized trials manipulating sugar alone in real lives are hard. Confounders like overall diet, sleep, and activity remain. We distinguish correlation, plausible mechanisms, and where causation is strongest. Frequent sugary drinks increase risk. This is one of the more consistent findings. On global policies, sales and reformulation data after Mexico's soda tax, Chile's front-of-pack warnings, and the UK's tiered levy come from government reports, independent evaluations, and scanner datasets. What's firm? Reductions in taxed drink purchases, rises in bottled water sales, and widespread product reformulation to avoid higher tiers or labels. What's evolving? Health outcome changes take years. Early signals are promising but not final. Where we're careful, claims like more addictive than cocaine, simple villains, and universal mechanisms. We avoid invented quotes and anonymous, insider drama unless there's a verifiable document. We also note gaps, limited access to contemporaneous internal R&D datasets, incomplete sponsorship disclosures in older journals, and regional differences in policy enforcement. If you want to read deeper, start with Farm Bill summaries, tariff schedules, FDA rulemaking on nutrition facts, peer-reviewed reviews on sugar and cardiovascular risk, reports evaluating soda taxes, and histories of food marketing. Use primary sources where possible and treat punchy headlines as invitations to check the footnotes. One last human image to end on. Someone lifts a mug of unsweetened coffee after a month of small changes, braces for bitterness, and doesn't hate it anymore. That's what evidence looks like in a mouth.